Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are unpacking the wild, tragic, and absolutely fascinating history behind the deaths of U.S. presidents. We usually picture these historical figures as towering statues or frozen faces on Mount Rushmore, but the reality of their final moments is incredibly human, sometimes bizarre, and deeply shaped by the era in which they lived. But before we map out our journey, I've got a piece of mind-blowing historical trivia for you. What do the second, third, and fifth U.S. presidents, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Monroe, actually have in common? I'll give you a second to think about it. Ready? They all died on July 4th. I mean, no way, right? In what is arguably the most insane coincidence in U.S. history, three of our earliest leaders checked out on exactly America's birthday. It's a staggering piece of trivia, and it perfectly sets the stage for the strange historical journey we're about to take. So, here's how we're breaking this down today. 1. The July 4th curse. 2. Bad medicine and bizarre deaths. 3. Tragic and sudden assassinations. And 4. Modern science and longevity. All right, Chapter 1, The July 4th Curse, a spooky Independence Day coincidence. So get this, on exactly July 4th, 1826, which literally was the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams passed away. Then, exactly 5 years later, on July 4th, 1831, James Monroe, our fifth president, dies too. Oh, and fun fact, James Madison, the fourth president, missed this bizarre trifecta by just a few days. He died on June 28th. Now, the tragic irony here is just profound. Picture this. 90-year-old John Adams is battling heart failure, and he utters his famous final words. Thomas Jefferson survives. These two had been revolutionary friends, then bitter political rivals, and finally pen pal besties in their old age. But the reality? His lifelong frenemy had actually succumbed to an illness hours earlier, hundreds of miles away. Adams passed away completely unaware. Moving on to Chapter 2, Bad Medicine and Bizarre Deaths, when the cure is worse than the disease. To understand the death of our very first president, George Washington, we really need to wrap our heads around a terrifying early medical treatment called bloodletting. So Washington caught a serious throat infection, probably epiglottitis, after riding his horse in some freezing snowy weather. Today, a quick round of antibiotics would clear that right up. But back then, doctors relied on bloodletting, totally mistakenly believing that literally draining a patient's blood would somehow purge the sickness from their body. And Washington's doctors drained a staggering 80 ounces of his blood trying to cure this throat infection. To put that into perspective for you, that is roughly the equivalent of draining 6 cans of Red Bull straight from your veins. Instead of curing him, it absolutely ravaged his body and drastically accelerated his decline. But, incredibly, even while struggling to breathe and suffering from catastrophic blood loss at the hands of his own doctors, Washington maintained that legendary stoic demeanor of his. His unbelievably calm final words were simply, "'Tis well." He faced the end with zero fear. And Washington definitely wasn't alone when it comes to bizarre medical fates. For over a century, folks thought William Henry Harrison died from giving a 2-hour inaugural speech in the freezing rain without a coat. But modern experts, they actually point to contaminated White House drinking water causing typhoid fever. Then you've got Zachary Taylor. He tried to cool off during a sweltering DC summer by gorging on raw cherries and iced milk. Well, thanks to non-existent food safety back then, that gave him a fatal case of gastroenteritis. And James Garfield? Well, we're going to dive much deeper into his tragic medical malpractice story in just a bit. Speaking of simple things like iced milk and drinking water, let's look at Ulysses S. Grant. The celebrated war hero had lost his life savings in a Ponzi scheme and was diagnosed with throat cancer, which likely came from smoking up to 20 cigars a day. Knowing he was dying, Grant heroically pushed through just agonizing pain to write his memoirs. He was literally racing against the clock so his family wouldn't be left in poverty. And when his throat was finally too ravaged by the cancer to really speak at all, he left us with one final, very quiet request: water. That brings us to Chapter 3, Tragic and Sudden Assassinations, the darkest days in the presidency. We all remember Abraham Lincoln for some of the absolute greatest speeches in American history, but he never actually got to deliver an epic final speech. Instead, his last words were just casual, almost scandalous reassurance to his wife at Ford's Theater. They were holding hands in their private box, and she was worried about what their friend might think. Lincoln just replied, "She won't think anything about it." And moments later, John Wilkes Booth struck. Now remember James Garfield from earlier? The wild thing is, the assassin's bullet actually lodged safely in his back. It totally missed all his vital organs. He absolutely should have survived. But then his doctors stepped in, literally probing his open wound with unsterilized bare fingers. They accidentally punctured his liver and introduced massive amounts of bacteria. So an assassin's bullet didn't actually kill James Garfield. His doctor's dirty hands subjected him to 80 days of fatal infections.
This ongoing pattern of medical tragedy finally forced a massive reckoning. When William McKinley was shot by an anarchist during a meet and greet in Buffalo, doctors once again failed. They couldn't locate the bullet, which led to fatal gangrene 8 days later. But that specific failure completely changed history. The nation had finally had enough, and the Secret Service was officially given the full-time responsibility to protect the President of the United States. But, as we all know, even those protective measures couldn't stop every tragedy. Take this quote from John F. Kennedy. While riding in that open motorcade in Dallas, the First Lady of Texas turned to him and said, "Mr. President, you can't say Dallas doesn't love you." JFK replied with this chillingly ironic final agreement. "No, you certainly can't." Just seconds later, the sniper's bullet struck, tragically ending his life at just 46 years old. All right, Chapter 4, Modern Science and Longevity, Outliving the Oval Office. So, back in the 18th and 19th centuries, the average lifespan of a president was just 70 years. But hit the 20th century, and boom, thanks to antibiotics, modern surgical techniques, and advanced security, we see a clear jump up to an average of 78 years. The role of commander-in-chief is still, for sure, the most dangerous job in the world, but our leaders are surviving longer than ever before. And absolutely nothing proves this medical triumph quite like the number 100. Jimmy Carter recently reached a full century of life, becoming the very first U.S. president to ever hit that milestone, before passing away on December 29, 2024. His incredibly long life is just the ultimate testament to how far we've come from the dark days of fatal bloodletting and unsterilized medical probes. When we zoom out and look at the full scope of history, the statistics are pretty staggering. Out of all our presidents, 8 died while in office. Exactly half of those, 4, were assassinated, and the other 4 passed from natural causes. We've got the heartbreaking low of John F. Kennedy dying at just 46, contrasted right alongside the triumphant longevity of Jimmy Carter reaching 100. It's a massive, wild spectrum of the human experience, all packed into a single political office. We've literally gone from presidents dying of bad drinking water and fatal bloodletting, all the way to commanders-in-chief hitting 100 years old, completely surrounded by state-of-the-art medical care and elite security. And this matters immensely, because the health of the president is ultimately tied directly to the stability of the entire nation. So as medical science and security continue advancing at just lightning speed, how will future discoveries change the history books yet again? What is the next century going to look like for the highest office in the land? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope this deep dive gave you a totally new perspective. Keep learning, and I'll catch you on the next one.